Hello everyone, it's Friday and you're watching Within the Frame where we delve deeper into the top stories not only in South Korea but across the globe. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. On Thursday, President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida agreed to open up a new era of bilateral ties. The summit came less than 2 weeks after Seoul announced its compensation plan for wartime forced labor victims. Many say Yoon's summit with the Japanese leader signified a fresh start for bilateral ties, and it is meaningful that active diplomacy is resumed. But some say there are still many lingering issues both countries need to figure out. In historians' eyes and from the third party's perspective, what significance did this summit have? What is the most important aspect to consider when governments deal with historical feuds? For an in-depth analysis of ties between Seoul and Tokyo, we invited a very special guest, renowned historian Alexis Dudden, professor of history at the University of Connecticut. Professor Dudden, welcome to the show and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for including me.
Right, first question to you, Professor. The summit between President Yoon and Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida came less than 2 weeks after Seoul announced using a public foundation affiliated with the Interior Ministry to compensate Korean victims of Japanese wartime forced labor with donations from domestic businesses. And Yoon also added that South Korea would not seek any reimbursement from Japan after compensating the victims. What are your thoughts on this plan?
Thank you for this question. It is obviously desirable that Seoul and Tokyo are resuming diplomacy. The plan is already being condemned by the victims themselves and their supporters, so it looks as if President Yoon is going to have a lot of work to make this plan appeal and have traction. It seems the plan has been in motion for about 20 years, at least, the idea of setting up such a fund. This seems rather hurried, rushed for immediate political gain. And so it is going to be a steep uphill battle for his administration, I think.
Right, I see. Now, watchers were focused on how Japan would reciprocate Seoul's decision, and just yesterday, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida said current Japanese government inherits the historical perceptions of past governments. How do you see Japan's words? Were they sufficient?
Again, really important because it's not all that Prime Minister Kishida announced, as well as his government, which essentially said, done deal. We're not talking about history anymore, and actually used the phrase that has upset victims and historians, which is not to use the term forced labor, but sort of workers who came from the old Korean peninsula to Japan, as if it were, some voluntary action on their part. And so the words in Tokyo are quite important to follow. And again, this is where the upcoming weeks of inter-Japan and Korea diplomacy, as well as the involvement of the United States, will be critical.
Right. Professor, so that means the word choice was also quite regrettable. Professor, two of the biggest business groups from South Korea and Japan said they will each establish 2 future partnership funds as part of the resolution to the row over Japan's wartime forced labor. How do you believe this joint economic fund would be able to contribute to better resolving the wartime forced labor compensation issue?
Well, actually, I'm a big fan of student exchange programs, civil society engagement. So the creation of a new scholarship opportunity for young Koreans, young Japanese, I think is wonderful. It also will allow both sides to learn more about the history that is deeply shared between the countries. That the creation of this new fund, this new scholarship program, is supposed to be kind of a bait and switch, however, to get away from the issues at hand, that is to say, the issue of forced labor, of forced militarized sexual slavery. It seems an unusual approach, but it's not unique to this. This is something that, for example, the United States long practiced with Japan. And so, ironically, this could lead to greater criticism in the future of both sides, because the more students understand, the more the future understands about the past, the deeper the awareness of the historical grievances.
Right, so this fund might have to face greater criticism in the future. Right.
From future scholars, yeah.
Yes. Professor, nearly 60% of South Koreans are reportedly very much against the government's plan, saying this plan is without direct contributions from Japanese firms. How do you believe the South Korean government will have to deal with this public opinion?
It's interesting to me that the South Korean 60% opposed sort of mirrors exactly the 60% in Japan that favors this. I think, again, this is how the perception gap is really important to understand. Japanese are fed up with talking about this. This is now being reported as we never have to talk about history again, and we didn't do anything wrong. Conversely, in South Korea, the 60% who are upset will continue to talk about it and will continue to make it a political issue, again, largely because the victims themselves are dissatisfied. So really, in an ideal world, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida would do something generous and actually encourage Japanese corporations to own up to their own history. However, from what I understand, that doesn't seem to be happening quickly. And honestly, I don't understand how a plan about forced labor of Koreans in the past without including Mitsubishi, Mitsui, the Sumitomo, the major corporations that used forced Korean labor, without their involvement, it does not really seem to make a lot of sense.
Right. I mean, there are many opinions like yours saying that direct involvement from the Japanese firms that are liable by South Korean Supreme Court should be in the compensation plan. Now, shifting gears a bit here, during your interview for one of public broadcaster's documentary, I noticed how you mentioned that part of the reason the historical conflict between Seoul and Tokyo has gone on for so long and has even become politicized is because of the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951. Could you elaborate more on this?
Yeah, so the 1951 San Francisco Treaty essentially was in the United States' creation of it, exonerated Japan, or at least exculpated, removed Japan from wartime responsibility. And it also denied Korea both Koreas at the time. The Korean War was at its height when this treaty came into being. Neither Koreas had a voice in this treaty. And so it sort of sets in motion the American architecture of the region. And we see the blowback from that very much now in these lingering legacies that have come to define the fault lines of Northeast Asia, particularly the issues of forced labor and territorial disputes.
Right. In that sense, the United States stressed that the first such summit in 12 years marks new chapter of cooperation and partnership, and it also added that U.S. will continue to support two countries as they take steps to translate this new understanding into enduring progress. But how do you believe Washington's position should be when it comes to the two counterparts dealing with this kind of issues related to past history?
This is one of the things I feel most as an American citizen is Washington's determination to think that history is simply background music to the present and that it will just go away and doesn't matter. Americans are famous for not understanding how history informs reality and in the present. And so one of the real things that's noticeable to me is that this current mood is not very different from 20 years ago. And yet so much has happened in between, especially awareness of the United States' own role in creating and sustaining a lot of these problems. So I do believe that it is very much in Washington's interest to take a harder look at its own place in the problem. I mean, again, yes, it is desirable that Seoul and Tokyo get together and move forward. That something is new about this seems a bit back to the future to me.
Right, I see. Now, Professor, I mean, I hope more than anybody that summit could result in, possibility of mending ties between for the bilateral ties. But there are many lingering concerns that we need to take a look at, and one of them is Japan repeating its sovereignty claims to South Korea's easternmost islet, Dokdo. What is your view on this dispute in terms of history, and how do you believe both countries will have to deal with this?
I think the expression "dokdo는 우리 땅입니다," it is our land, explains it all. And I
Right.
think, this is what I mean by this current deal feels a lot like Back to the Future, because for years, a number of institutes in both public research institutes in both Tokyo and Seoul have looked at what shapes grievances among both countries. It may surprise some viewers that most people actually don't care about forced labor. They don't care about militarized sexual slavery. They do care about territory. And so that Prime Minister Kishida apparently, even yesterday, reasserted Japan's claims to Dokdo can only be a political minefield for President Yoon, because I don't believe most Koreans would be willing to give an inch of that territory.
Right, I cannot agree more. Professor, since you already tapped on the issue of military sexual slavery, addressing the history of wartime sexual slavery, euphemistically called comfort woman, is another lingering issue we need to take a look at. How should this issue be addressed, and how should we deal with some distortions like those made by Harvard Law School Professor John Mark Lemzier, who argue that wartime Korean sex slaves were voluntarily contracted prostitutes?
Well, I think what's really important is what the victims themselves have done in recent years, which is to move this history, the conversation about the history, beyond a question of Korea versus Japan. This is a multinational, transnational history. The United Nations has long declared it a crime against humanity. And I think when we step back today and look and really wonder why studying this history matters, we see examples of this history of horror existing today in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We know that Ukrainian girls and women are being forcibly taken to Russia. And this is a very, tragic history unfolding in the present that mirrors what happened to the victims in the 1930s and 40s throughout the Empire of Japan. And again, this is exactly why studying that history matters immediately, is to put an end to the trafficking of minors and women for the purposes of sex, targeting them during wartime.
Right. So what matters the most is, of course, victims' voices. Professor, historical disputes are fueling conflicts over cultural heritage as well. Japan made its first unsuccessful attempt in February last year to have the Sado Island gold mines inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, but again showed its commitment by submitting again early this year. And of course, this prompted a protest from Seoul, as this is the place where many Koreans were forced into hard labor during Japan's colonization of the Korean Peninsula between 1910 to 1945. What is your take on this? How should this be tackled?
I think what Japan's effort to erase a portion of its history in the way that it made the application to UNESCO, it simply took out the history of the 1930s and 40s. It took out the 20th century as if it didn't happen. And so for me, rather than a Korea versus Japan fight, I really look at this as something that divides Japan, because many Japanese researchers are protesting this as well and saying, no, we can't make an application about a historical site and just skip the 20th century. It makes absolutely no sense. But that's what I mean by this is sort of a fault line within Japanese society over addressing national history.
Right, so even Japanese scholars are protesting to this plan by Japan right now?
Yes. Yes, Japanese historians, Japanese activists, Japanese researchers who know the history of this mine, and really it's from a lot of their hard work collectively on forced labor, from which we learn so much about how the inner workings of Japan's imperial mechanisms worked. And again, that's why we study history. All of these histories of humans trafficked throughout the empire show us how these forced slave occupation mechanisms work. And so that's why we study them. We don't study them to bash Japan today. And I think that that's the difference in weaponizing history or politicizing history. It becomes a tool rather than something from which we learn about how to create better societies.
Right, I see. Now, Professor, though foreign media outlets say bitter relations have been resolved with this time's summit and that a new page is ready to be turned, amid a long history of acrimony between the two East Asian neighbors, it doesn't look like it will be that easy, especially considering the public's point of view and their opinion. In dealing with such historical issues, what should both countries' governments consider the most?
I think that they should, when they talk about looking to the future, understand that when younger generations, I believe President Yoon gave a very interesting lecture at a Japanese university in Tokyo yesterday, emphasizing the importance of looking forward. And of course, we all want to look forward, but that doesn't have to come at the expense of recognizing what happened in the past as actually creating where we are today. And that's this sort of just turning your back on the past does not make history go away. Rather, addressing history openly, honestly, and you don't have to be ashamed. I mean, I'm an American. Our country is founded on genocide and slavery. It doesn't make me want to give up my passport. And so it's this sort of, you can address straight the past. You can, with your eyes open, look at what happened, and from that, build a better future rather than just telling it to go away.
Right, I see. Great advice. Professor, I think this could be our last question, but what should each country's attitude be towards each other amid an era of complex crisis, uncertainties in global geopolitics, North Korea's continuous provocations, and disruption in the industrial supply chain?
Right. So the million-dollar question, how to make a peaceful future. It's obvious that it is in everyone's interest for Tokyo and Seoul to have better open relations. And so this, of course, is a welcome development. I really do think that this is up to Japan to be more generous, to really recognize that this is a big gamble from South Korea. Obviously, many South Koreans are criticizing this. Many prominent South Korean organizations are criticizing it. Victims are criticizing it. At the same time, if Tokyo does not show some generosity of spirit here and actual tangible owning up, having Japanese corporations involved in this settlement, for example, would be primary. But I really am, I won't say nervous, but I am hopeful that Japan does not press the Dokdo issue, because that is the known dividing line from which there is no wiggle room. And I'm a little worried that the terms of this agreement have bolstered Japan's self-confidence so much that Korea doesn't matter, that there may be an increase in claim to that territory.
Right. I also hope to see Japan to show much generous attitude regarding all the issues we have discussed until now. I'd like to ask more questions, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Dudden, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right, this is all for Within the Frame tonight. We will be next Monday with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the weekend. Goodbye.